In the mountains of western North Carolina stands a house that should not exist, a monument to a forgotten world. This is Biltmore Estate. It contains 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. It has 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. It even has its own indoor swimming pool. When George Vanderbilt completed construction in 1895, the project had taken 6 years and cost approximately $6 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $200 million in today's money. No American has built anything even remotely comparable since, and the reason for that has nothing to do with changing architectural tastes or a decline in ambition. The world that made Biltmore possible was destroyed deliberately through taxation, regulation, and a wave of public fury against extreme wealth. But what replaced it reveals something much darker about modern inequality. The billionaires didn't disappear, they simply learned to hide. To understand how Biltmore came to be, we have to go back to 1888. George Washington Vanderbilt II was just 26 years old, and he controlled a fortune that exceeded the annual budget of most American states. He was the youngest grandson of the legendary Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had died 11 years earlier as the richest man in America. The Commodore built his empire on steamships and railroads, completely transforming transportation across the continent. When he passed away in 1877, his estate was valued at around $105 million. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire United States Treasury held in gold reserves at the time. That incredible fortune passed primarily to the Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, and William proved to be even more ruthless and capable than his father. In just 8 years, he doubled the inheritance through aggressive railroad expansion and shrewd management. When William died in 1885, he left a staggering $200 million to be divided among his 8 children. George, the youngest, received roughly $10 million outright, plus a substantial income from a trust fund. At just 23 years old, he was wealthier than he could ever hope to spend in several lifetimes. But George was different from the rest of his family. His older brothers were busy building massive mansions in Manhattan and Newport, Rhode Island, locked in a competition to construct the most extravagant showpieces on Fifth Avenue and along the coast. They threw costume balls that cost fortunes and filled newspapers with scandalous stories of their excess. George, however, preferred books to parties. He was an intellectual who spoke 8 languages, collected rare art, and spent his time traveling Europe, studying architecture and landscape design. He was shy, introspective, and deeply uncomfortable with the loud, performative displays of wealth that defined Gilded Age society. Then, in 1888, a trip would change everything. George visited Asheville, North Carolina, on the advice of his doctors. They recommended the crisp mountain air for his chronic respiratory problems. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by the stunning Blue Ridge Mountains. It was accessible by railroad but still felt remote and peaceful, a world away from the bustling eastern cities. The climate was mild, the scenery was spectacular, and most importantly, the land was cheap. George saw something more than just a health retreat. The sprawling forests reminded him of the grand European estates he had admired on his travels. The mountains offered a natural boundary, promising privacy and seclusion. The region was still recovering from the economic devastation of the Civil War, which meant that labor and materials would cost a fraction of what they would in the industrialized North. He realized he could build something here, something that would be impossible anywhere else. He began purchasing land almost immediately. By 1889, he had acquired a staggering 125,000 acres of land surrounding Asheville. That's an area larger than many major American cities, and the price he paid was remarkably low. Much of the land had been overlogged or farmed to the point of exhaustion. Local landowners, struggling to make ends meet, were more than eager to sell their properties to the wealthy northerner offering cash. With the land secured, George hired the absolute best designers money could buy. For the house itself, he chose Richard Morris Hunt, America's most celebrated architect. Trained at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, Hunt was the man behind the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty and numerous Fifth Avenue mansions for the Vanderbilt family. He understood grand scale, classical elegance, and how to make a statement. George gave him a simple but immense challenge: design a house worthy of its majestic mountain setting. For the landscape, George turned to the legendary Frederick Law Olmsted. This was the genius who had designed Central Park in Manhattan, along with beautiful parks in dozens of other American cities. Olmsted was a master at shaping the natural world into a work of art. The team was assembled. The vision was set. George Vanderbilt, the quiet intellectual, was about to build the largest private home in American history, a French Renaissance chateau in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. He wasn't just building a house, he was creating a world of his own, a sanctuary of art, nature, and beauty that would stand for centuries. And the story of its creation is as fascinating as the house itself. Imagine you're at the peak of your career, a legend in your field. That was Frederick Law Olmsted, the pioneer of American landscape architecture, when he got a call from a man named George Vanderbilt. At 67, Olmsted was at the top of his game, but this new project was unlike anything he'd ever faced. George, a member of the famously wealthy Vanderbilt family, had a vision. He wanted Olmsted to take 125,000 acres of North Carolina wilderness, mostly logged-out forest and worn-out farmland, and turn it into a magnificent estate, something that would rival the grandest properties in Europe. Initially, the idea was surprisingly modest. George just wanted a country house, a quiet retreat where he could escape the hustle of society and dive into his books and hobbies. The architect, Richard Morris Hunt, even sketched a simple, comfortable home. Olmsted, for his part, suggested some nice gardens and a functional farm. But George's ambition, fueled by his vast inheritance, quickly grew. The project exploded in scale. With every new sketch from Hunt, the house became more elaborate, more magnificent. George started adding to his wish list. He needed a library, not just a small room, but a grand hall to house his ever-expanding collection of thousands of books. He wanted plenty of guest rooms for his family and friends to stay for long visits. He needed spaces for entertaining, for the occasional high society gathering, and he insisted on the latest technology to make this massive house comfortable and modern. To find inspiration for such a unique home, Hunt looked across the Atlantic to the Loire Valley in France. The famous chateau there with a perfect blend of grandeur and comfort, of formal elegance and livability. He took that style and brought it to the American South, designing a breathtaking 4-story limestone mansion. It had a steep, dramatic roof, huge chimneys, and intricate stone carvings. This was French Renaissance revival, but with a distinctly American twist. While Hunt was designing the house of a lifetime, Olmsted was planning something equally revolutionary for the land. His vision went far beyond just planting a few flower beds around the house. He planned to manage the entire 125,000-acre property. Closest to the residence would be exquisite formal gardens. But beyond that, he would create vast, planned forests, a living demonstration of scientific forestry. He also designed a model farm, intended to prove that modern agricultural techniques could bring the region's depleted soil back to life. The entire Biltmore Estate was designed to be a self-sufficient world, producing its own food, lumber, and even its own income. Construction kicked off in 1889, and the sheer scale was mind-boggling. To even get the materials to the remote site, a private railroad spur had to be built. Limestone, the primary building material, was quarried all the way up in Indiana and shipped down by train. An army of craftsmen was recruited from all over the United States and even Europe. At its busiest, over 1,000 workers were on site at the same time, laboring on the house and the grounds. Nothing like this had ever been attempted by a private citizen in America. The engineering was just as impressive. The foundations had to be dug deep into the solid bedrock. A massive steel frame was engineered to support stone walls that were 4 feet thick. The roof alone covered more than an acre of space. Every single part of the house was built to last, as if it were meant to stand for not just decades, but for centuries. George Vanderbilt wasn't a distant owner. He was deeply involved in every step. He visited the construction site constantly, making decisions on everything from the specific type of stone to use, to the exact placement of furniture inside. He worked side by side with Hunt and Olmsted, tweaking and refining the plans as the magnificent structure began to rise from the ground. This project became his obsession, his life's work. He had little interest in the family business or in politics. Building Biltmore was everything to him. The house itself was a masterpiece of functional design, organized to perfection. The ground floor was for public life. It featured a colossal banquet hall that could seat 64 guests for dinner. There was the 2-story library, designed to eventually hold over 20,000 volumes. It also had a billiard room, a music room, and several sitting rooms for conversation and relaxation. Moving up, the second floor was the family's private domain, with the main bedrooms and luxurious guest suites. The third floor offered more guest rooms and storage space, while the fourth floor, tucked away under the roofline, housed the quarters for the many servants needed to run such a massive household. And hidden beneath it all was a sprawling basement that was a world of its own. It contained the main kitchens, the laundry facilities, and all the mechanical systems that kept the house running. It even had a 70,000-gallon indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a gymnasium. Biltmore was also a technological marvel, far ahead of its time. Electric lights, powered by the estate's own generator, were in every room, a rare luxury in the 1890s. Central heating pushed steam through miles of pipes to keep the enormous space warm. There was an internal telephone system for instant communication between floors, and electric elevators to move people and supplies around. Many of the innovations found in Biltmore wouldn't become common in most American homes for decades. While the house was going up, Olmsted's team was hard at work transforming the landscape. They planted hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs. Many were native species, part of the forestry project, but many others were imported from Europe and Asia to create stunning, exotic gardens. The approach to the house was carefully choreographed. Visitors would travel along a 3-mile approach road that Olmsted designed to build anticipation. The road winds through a carefully crafted forest, hiding the house from view until the very last moment, when it's revealed in all its glory. The formal gardens near the house were a series of outdoor rooms. There was a 4-acre walled garden with intricate flower beds, an Italian garden with symmetrical pools, and a shrub garden featuring one of the country's most extensive collections of native azaleas. Beyond the formal gardens, Olmsted established America's first managed forest, pioneering the field of scientific forestry. He created nurseries to grow the millions of trees needed to reforest the mountainsides. After 6 long years of construction, on Christmas Eve of 1895, George Vanderbilt finally opened the doors of Biltmore House to his family and friends. The house was complete, a monument to his vision, his wealth, and the genius of his collaborators, Hunt and Olmsted. It was a Gilded Age palace, the largest private home in America, with 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. But George's vision didn't stop there. He and his wife Edith made Biltmore their home and started a family. They were active in the community, establishing schools and promoting local crafts. After George's unexpected death in 1914, Edith continued his work. She sold a large portion of the forested land to the federal government, which became the nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest, preserving Olmsted's forestry legacy for the public. To keep the estate financially viable during the Great Depression, their daughter, Cornelia, made the difficult decision to open Biltmore House to the public in 1930. It was a move that saved the estate and allowed millions of people to experience its grandeur. Today, Biltmore is still owned by the descendants of George Vanderbilt. It remains a stunning example of Gilded Age ambition and a testament to the incredible collaboration of a visionary owner, a brilliant architect, and a master landscape designer. It's more than just a house. It's a living piece of American history. Imagine, for a moment, the grandest home you can. Now, multiply that by 10, and you might get close to Biltmore. This isn't just a house. It's a testament to a bygone era, a dream of Gilded Age ambition built in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it all started with one man, George Washington Vanderbilt II. In the late 1880s, George, the grandson of the railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, fell in love with the scenic beauty of Asheville, North Carolina. But he didn't just want a simple country retreat. He envisioned something monumental, a home that would rival the chateau of the French Loire Valley. And so, the 6-year journey to build the largest private residence in American history began. The scale of the project was staggering. George hired the most renowned architect of the day, Richard Morris Hunt, to design his palace. He also brought in Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary landscape architect behind New York's Central Park, to sculpt the surrounding land. This wasn't just about building a house. It was about creating an entire world. Let's start with the approach. Olmsted designed a 3-mile road that intentionally wound through carefully planned forests. The idea was to build suspense, to create a sense of journey and discovery. You wouldn't see the house at all until the final turn, when it would suddenly appear, rising majestically from a terraced hillside. It was pure architectural theater. On Christmas Eve of 1895, after 6 years of relentless construction and a cost of around $6 million, that's over $200 million, in today's money, George Vanderbilt finally opened the doors of Biltmore to his family. Imagine the scene: snow blanketing the mountains outside, and inside, a marvel of modern living. The numbers alone are mind-boggling. The house sprawls across 4 acres of floor space, about 175,000 square feet. It contains 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms for family and guests, 43 bathrooms with modern plumbing, rare luxury at the time, and a staggering 65 fireplaces. The exterior, crafted from Indiana limestone, is a masterpiece of the Chateausk style. The walls are 4 feet thick at the foundation, and the steeply pitched slate roof is adorned with intricate chimneys and spires. European craftsmen were brought in to carve the elaborate Renaissance details that cover the facade. From a distance, it looked as if a French palace had been magically transported to the Appalachian Mountains. Stepping inside was like entering another world. The entrance hall itself soars 3 stories high, dominated by a massive wrought iron chandelier. But the true heart of the home, for many, is the banquet hall. Its barrel-vaulted ceiling rises 75 feet, creating a space grand enough to seat 64 guests at a single, massive table. It feels less like a dining room and more like a medieval great hall. For George, a passionate scholar and collector, the library was his personal sanctuary. It's a 2-story masterpiece designed to hold 10,000 volumes. Though George's personal collection already exceeded 20,000 books in 8 different languages, A spiral staircase grants access to the upper balcony, and a secret passageway, known as the den, is hidden behind a fireplace panel. But Biltmore wasn't just about old-world grandeur. It was a showcase of cutting-edge technology. This was a smart home of the 1890s. The entire estate was powered by its own electrical generating plant. Electric lights meant no more smoky gas or oil lamps. A central heating system pumped steam through miles of copper pipes to radiators in every main room, and an electric intercom system connected the vast network of rooms, allowing George to summon staff with the push of a button. The amenities for recreation were equally astounding. The basement was an entertainment complex that rivaled the most exclusive hotels. It featured a bowling alley with equipment imported from Europe. There was a 70-foot-long indoor swimming pool, lined with beautiful tile, a rare luxury for a private home. Next to it, a fully equipped gymnasium catered to the era's interest in physical fitness. One of the most enchanting spaces is the Winter Garden. This glass-roofed conservatory brought the tropics to the mountains. A central fountain is surrounded by lush, exotic plants and palm trees that reach toward skylights 3 stories above. It was a permanent summer oasis, a demonstration that with enough wealth and technology, you could even overcome the climate. Beyond the house itself, the estate was a sprawling enterprise. It encompassed thousands of acres with dairy operations, vast vegetable gardens, and livestock. Biltmore was designed to be a self-sustaining community. When George Vanderbilt moved into Biltmore at the age of 33, he had accomplished his goal. He had built the largest private home in America, a project that employed thousands of workers and proved that American wealth could create something to rival the palaces of Europe. But there's a poignant twist to this story. In a way, Biltmore was already a relic the moment it was finished. The world that made such extravagant displays of private wealth possible was on the cusp of dramatic change. The Gilded Age was giving way to the progressive era. Income tax was on the horizon, and the very idea of a single family living in such opulence was becoming a thing of the past. George had built his dream, a magnificent anachronistic castle in the clouds. It was a residence, a museum, and a bold statement about the pinnacle of private ambition. Today, Biltmore stands not just as a monument to George Vanderbilt's vision, but as a perfectly preserved time capsule, offering us a breathtaking glimpse into a world of unparalleled luxury that has long since vanished. It remains a uniquely American masterpiece, a fairy tale castle nestled in the Carolina mountains. Ever wondered what it was like to live in America's largest private home? Today, we're stepping back in time to explore the incredible story of the Biltmore Estate, a Gilded Age marvel that was both a triumph of ambition and a financial ticking time bomb. When George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore in 1895, it was a palace of the future. It had 2 elevators, one for people and one for freight, and massive refrigeration systems to keep food fresh. These were technologies most American buildings wouldn't see for decades. Just running the place required a staff of over 80 people living right there on the estate. Inside the house, 30 servants worked as cooks, maids, and butlers. Outside, an army of workers managed the machinery, tended the sprawling gardens, and ran the farm. The 4th floor was basically a self-contained village just for the staff, complete with their own bedrooms, dining rooms, and a secret network of back stairs so they could move through the mansion without ever being seen by the family. But the house was just the beginning. The famous landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, the genius behind New York's Central Park, designed the entire 125,000-acre property. Right around the house, he created a series of stunning formal gardens. There was the Italian garden with its reflecting pool and classical statues, and a huge 4-acre walled garden bursting with flowers, arranged in perfect geometric patterns. The shrub garden was like a living museum, collecting plants from all over the world, while the ramble offered quiet walking paths through a beautifully crafted woodland. Beyond these gardens, Olmsted had an even bigger idea, a managed forest. He brought in Gifford Pinchot, who would later head the U.S. Forest Service, to pioneer scientific forestry. Their goal was revolutionary, to prove that you could harvest timber from a forest sustainably and still make a profit. The Biltmore Forestry Program became a national model for conservation and helped train a whole new generation of professional foresters. And then there was the farm. Covering thousands of acres, it was designed to make the estate completely a dairy herd provided milk, butter, and cheese. Sprawling vegetable gardens supplied the kitchen. Livestock provided meat, and orchards produced fresh fruit. The idea was to produce everything needed for daily life, and even sell the surplus to make money. But here's the twist. The dream of a self-sufficient paradise quickly ran into a harsh reality. The estate's operating costs were staggering, over $250,000 a year, which is millions in today's money. George Vanderbilt was incredibly wealthy, but the estate was burning through his inheritance faster than his investments could replenish it. Just a few years after moving in, he was already looking for ways to cut costs. In 1898, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, and their daughter Cornelia was born in 1900. She would be their only child. So, this enormous house, built to host lavish parties for dozens of guests and run by a staff of 80, was now home to a family of just 3. George tried everything to make Biltmore pay for itself. He started a commercial dairy to sell Biltmore brand products to the public. He sold timber from his managed forests. He tried different farming techniques, but nothing worked. The revenue he generated was just a drop in the bucket compared to the massive expense of maintaining the estate. The house was simply too big, too grand, too expensive for anyone to afford, even a Vanderbilt. The problem wasn't personal, it was historical. Biltmore was built at the absolute peak of the Gilded Age, a brief, magical moment when immense fortunes faced almost no taxes. Labor was cheap, and society saw extreme wealth as a sign of success. But that era was already ending. The financial panic of 1893 had shaken the country. Labor unions were rising up, and politicians were starting to ask if it was right for so much wealth to be concentrated in the hands of so few. The world that had made Biltmore possible was disappearing. Tragedy struck in 1914 when George Vanderbilt died suddenly at the age of 51. His widow, Edith, inherited the magnificent estate, but also its crippling financial problems. With rising property taxes and a changing public attitude towards extreme wealth, she faced an impossible choice. So, Edith made a groundbreaking decision that would save Biltmore, but change it forever. In 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression, she opened the house and gardens to the public. For the first time, paying tourists could walk the halls and see how the titans of the Gilded Age had lived. The family kept a small, private section of the house, but their home was now a public attraction, its survival dependent on admission fees. This transformation revealed a fundamental truth about these grand mansions. They were unsustainable as private homes. The economic system that built them had vanished. Other famous Vanderbilt estates, like the Breakers in Newport, would eventually follow the same path, opening their doors to the public or facing the wrecking ball. They stand today not just as symbols of incredible wealth, but as reminders of a time that was as dazzling as it was fleeting. The generation that built these houses imagined them as dynasty headquarters, fortresses of family legacy meant to shelter their descendants for centuries. Instead, they became tourist attractions within just a few decades. Biltmore, for example, stood at the absolute peak of American mansion building. It was the largest, the most expensive, and ultimately, the last of its kind. Nothing on that scale would ever be built in America again. It wasn't because Americans suddenly lost their ambition or their wealth. Within just 20 years, they would fundamentally alter how wealthy Americans could live and what they could build. In 1913, the very same year that Biltmore's creator, George Vanderbilt, passed away, the United States government made a move that would reshape the landscape of American wealth forever. On February 3rd, the states finalized the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. This gave Congress the permanent power to levy taxes on income from whatever source derived. The era of untaxed Gilded Age fortunes was officially over. Before 1913, the federal government had only imposed an income tax once, and it was a temporary measure during the Civil War that expired in 1872. Another attempt in 1895 was struck down by the Supreme Court. So for most of the Gilded Age, the wealthiest Americans faced practically no federal income tax. They could accumulate and spend their incredible fortunes with little government interference beyond some modest tariffs. The 16th Amendment changed everything. In October 1913, Congress passed the first permanent income tax law. Now, at first, the rates seemed incredibly modest. Income below $3,000 wasn't taxed at all. Income between $3,000 and $20,000 was taxed at just 1%. The top rate, a mere 7%, only applied to incomes over $500,000 a year, which affected maybe a few hundred families in the entire country. But those modest rates didn't last long. World War I created an unprecedented need for government revenue. In 1916, Congress raised the top rate to 15%. A year later, it soared to 67%. By 1918, it hit a staggering 77%, and the income level for that top bracket dropped to $1 million, capturing more of the wealthy. To put that in perspective, a man earning $2 million in 1918 would have to hand over more than $1.5 million of it to the federal government. The war ended, but the high tax rates largely remained. They came down a bit in the 1920s, with the top rate dropping to 25% by 1925. For a brief moment, it looked like things might return to the pre-war norm. Wealthy families even started building and spending again. trying to recapture that Gilded Age glamour. But then the Great Depression hit, and that hope was destroyed permanently. The stock market crashed in October 1929. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment skyrocketed to 25% nationally. The American economy shrank by a third in just 4 years. As breadlines grew longer in shanty towns or Hoovervilles spread across the country, public anger towards the wealthy intensified. Even President Herbert Hoover, a wealthy man himself, proposed raising taxes on the rich to fund relief programs. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1932, pushing the top rate back up to 63%. When Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide that same year, he made higher taxes on the wealthy a core part of his New Deal. The Revenue Act of 1935, nicknamed the wealth tax, raised the top rate to 79% on income over $5 million. Roosevelt argued that extreme inequality was a threat to democracy itself. By 1940, the top marginal rate had hit 81%. During World War II, it climbed to an almost unbelievable 94% on any income over $200,000. For the next 3 decades, the top rate never fell below 70%. A wealthy American earning $1 million a year might only get to keep less than $100,000 of it after federal taxes. But the income tax was only one part of the squeeze on the economics of these grand mansions. Estate taxes, which hit when wealth was passed from one generation to the next, were the second blow. Congress first brought in a federal estate tax in 1916, with a max rate of 10% on estates over $5 million, but that rate rose steadily. By 1924, it was 25%. By 1934, it was 45%, and by 1941, it reached 77%. The combination of income and estate taxes was absolutely devastating for families trying to keep these massive estates running. A fortune that managed to survive the high income taxes during the builder's lifetime would then face the massive estate tax when he died. And there was a third leg to this tax system: property taxes. While the federal government was raising income and estate taxes, state and local governments, also desperate for cash during the Depression, were raising property taxes. A mansion that might have had a property tax bill of a few $1,000s in 1913 could suddenly be facing bills of over $50,000 a year by the 1930s. The ongoing cost of just owning one of these palaces became completely prohibitive, no matter what your income was. The math was simple and brutal. Let's take a mansion like Biltmore, which required about $250,000 a year to operate. In 1913, a man with an annual income of $500,000 faced no federal income tax and could easily cover those costs. But by 1935, that same $500,000 income faced federal taxes of nearly $400,000. The remaining $100,000 was nowhere near enough to maintain the estate, pay the escalating property taxes, and support the family. The dream of the Gilded Age mansion, meant to last for centuries, was dismantled not by cannonballs or revolution, but by tax codes and calculators. The era of the Great American Palace was over. Have you ever wondered what happened to all those incredible Gilded Age mansions? You know, the colossal palaces built by the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Rockefellers. A century ago, they were symbols of unimaginable wealth and power. Today, most of them are just memories, dust and echoes in history books. So, what brought down these American castles? It wasn't a revolution or a war. It was something much quieter, but far more effective: taxes. Let's travel back to the early 20th century. The Gilded Age was a time of extreme wealth, inequality, and society was getting restless. To address this, the government introduced a series of game-changing taxes. First came the federal income tax in 1913. Suddenly, the ultra-rich weren't just spending their money, they were sharing a chunk of it with Uncle Sam. Then came the estate tax, nicknamed the death tax. This meant that when a wealthy patriarch died, a significant portion of his fortune had to be handed over to the government before the rest could be passed on to his heirs. Imagine inheriting a billion-dollar empire, only to be hit with a tax bill for hundreds of millions. These two taxes created a powerful one-two punch against generational wealth. Families tried everything to soften the blow. They set up trusts and foundations, but these offered limited protection. They split assets among different family members to spread the burden. They made strategic, charitable donations to reduce their taxable estates. But it was like trying to plug a bursting dam with their fingers. For properties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just to maintain, these measures were only delaying the inevitable. On top of the income and estate taxes, there was the ever-present property tax. These local taxes were based on the assessed value of a property. For a gigantic mansion sitting on prime real estate, like Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the annual property tax bill alone could be astronomical. So, you had this triple threat: income tax shrinking your earnings, estate tax carving out a huge piece of your inheritance, and property tax constantly draining your cash reserves just to keep the house. The government hadn't made these mansions illegal. It had just made them financially impossible to sustain. The message was clear. Fortunes could still be made, but they couldn't be preserved intact across generations while funding such an extravagant lifestyle. The tax code had effectively solved the political problem of extreme wealth concentration, but the financial pressure didn't stop with taxes. Another crucial pillar of the Gilded Age lifestyle was crumbling: cheap labor. Before World War I, the domestic service industry employed millions of Americans. A grand mansion required a small army of servants, butlers, cooks, maids, footmen, gardeners, to run smoothly. But during the 1920s, this workforce began to vanish. Industrial jobs in factories started paying much better than household service. The social attitude also shifted. Being a servant was no longer seen as a respectable career. It became a symbol of the old world, something people wanted to escape. Even if a wealthy family could still afford a large staff, they found it increasingly difficult to hire qualified workers. Then came new labor laws. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established minimum wages and maximum working hours. State laws required workers' compensation insurance. Unions became more powerful, negotiating for better pay and conditions in all sorts of industries, including those that supplied goods and services to these mansions. The era of cheap, abundant, and unregulated labor, which had made the Gilded Age possible, was officially over. Of course, technology helped a little. New inventions partially compensated for the disappearing workforce. Central heating systems replaced the old coal furnaces that needed constant stoking. Electric refrigerators meant no more daily ice deliveries. Vacuum cleaners made cleaning less labor-intensive. But let's be real, no appliance could solve the fundamental problem. A 250-room house, like the Biltmore Estate, was still vastly more expensive and complicated to operate than a 20-room house. These mansions weren't just homes. They were massive, complex machines that consumed money and manpower at an alarming rate. Faced with this new reality, the wealthy had to adapt. They started to downsize. New construction in the 1920s and 30s was on a much smaller scale. Rich families still built large, comfortable homes, but they weren't building palaces anymore. 20 or 30 rooms became the new standard for the soupage. A 50-room house was considered exceptionally ambitious. Nobody even dreamed of trying to match Biltmore's 250 rooms. The existing mansions, once proud assets on a family's balance sheet, had become massive liabilities. The land they sat on was incredibly valuable, but the buildings themselves were actively destroying wealth through their insane operating costs and taxes. Families faced a brutal choice: keep the mansion and watch the family fortune slowly bleed away, or demolish the house, sell the land, and save the money. For most, the decision was a painful but logical one. The great mansion die-off was about to begin. The first dominoes fell on what was once the most exclusive street in America, Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. In 1926, the wrecking ball came for the magnificent mansion of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, located at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. It was a true palace, occupying an entire city block, with 130 rooms and a ballroom for 1,200 guests. The family had lived there for 43 years. It took less than 6 months to turn it into rubble. What replaced it? A bank and an office building. These new commercial properties generated rental income that dwarfed what the mansion had cost to maintain. The Vanderbilts had made the cold, hard, economically rational choice. This became a repeating pattern all over Manhattan. William Kissam, Vanderbilt's French chateau-style mansion at 665th Avenue, was demolished in 1927, just 44 years after it was built. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's mansion, the epicenter of New York high society, disappeared in 1926. Mrs. Astor was the undisputed queen of the social scene, and her annual ball for exactly 400 guests, the original 400, defined who was in and who was out. The very house that held this immense social power was torn down to make way for a luxury apartment building. The statistics are staggering. In 1900, more than 100 of these major Gilded Age palaces lined Fifth Avenue. By 1950, fewer than 10 remained. The rest were gone, replaced by apartment buildings, hotels, and office towers that were far more profitable. This wave of destruction wasn't confined to New York. It spread to other elite enclaves like Newport, Rhode Island, where the summer cottages were as grand as European palaces. Many of them met the same fate. So what happened to the billionaires? They didn't become poor. They remained extraordinarily wealthy. They just couldn't afford to live in 250-room houses anymore. This massive shift didn't just change the skyline of America's cities. It completely reshaped elite culture. The era of ostentatious, palace-like living was over, replaced by a more discreet and financially sustainable form of wealth. The Gilded Age mansions were magnificent, but in the end, they were no match for the simple, relentless logic of a tax return. Have you ever seen pictures of those incredible Gilded Age mansions? Places like the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, with its 70 rooms and opulent design, it's hard to imagine that these magnificent palaces, built to last for centuries, were almost all torn down. What happened? Why did America destroy its most beautiful homes? This is the story of how the grandest houses ever built in America vanished, and what took their place. Let's start in Newport, the summer playground of America's wealthiest families, like the Vanderbilts. These weren't just vacation homes, they were palaces. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1895, cost $7 million back then. That's over $200 million in today's money. To run a place like this for just 8 weeks in the summer, you needed a year-round staff of about 40 people. It was an astonishing level of wealth and luxury. But here's the shocking part. Within a few decades, even the Vanderbilts couldn't afford to keep these places. By 1948, the family faced a choice: donate the Breakers or demolish it. There was simply no way to maintain a 70-room house that required a private army of servants. So, they gave it to the Preservation Society of Newport County. This move gave them a nice tax deduction and saved the house from the wrecking ball. It opened to tourists that same year, and today, your admission ticket is what pays the bills. The same story played out all over Newport. Marble House, another Vanderbilt mansion, was donated in 1963. Rosecliff, Chateau-sur-Mer, they all survived because they stopped being private homes and became public attractions. The mansions that couldn't find a donor or a preservation society, they just disappeared. And it wasn't just a Newport problem. This happened in every major American city. Chicago lost almost its entire collection of Gilded Age mansions. Remember Potter Palmer's Castle on Lakeshore Drive? It was a landmark. 42 rooms with a 3-story art gallery inside. It defined elite architecture in the city. But by 1950, it was gone, demolished. Why? Because the land it stood on was worth more empty than with the house on it. Think about that. The economics were just inescapable. The annual cost to operate these mansions, from property taxes to the massive staff, was more than even the richest families were willing to spend. The land itself, sitting in a prime urban location, was screaming for something more profitable. What replaced these homes tells the story of a changing America. Apartment buildings went up, generating rent from hundreds of families on the same plot that once housed just one. Office buildings and hotels brought in even higher returns. The American real estate market had become too sophisticated, too expensive, to let single-family mansions sit on premium city land. It was a financial death sentence. So how did any of them survive? The very few that are still standing did so by completely changing their purpose. Take the Frick Collection in Manhattan. This was the home of industrialist Henry Clay Frick, but he was smart. When he built it in 1914, he designed it with the idea that it would one day become a museum. His will left an endowment to maintain it as a public art gallery, which it became in 1935. It was preserved because its future was planned. Another great example is the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, which used to be Andrew Carnegie's mansion on Fifth Avenue, a 64-room house built in 1902 when Carnegie built it. It was so far uptown that people thought he was crazy, but he got the land for a cheaper price. In 1972, his family donated it to the Smithsonian. Again, it survived because it became something other than a private residence. You see the pattern here. Institutional use meant preservation. Residential use meant demolition. Even the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, the largest private home in America, had to adapt. The Vanderbilt family still owns it, but they couldn't afford to live there privately. In 1930, they opened it to the public. The admission fees from tourists pay for the upkeep that would bankrupt any single family. The house became a museum where, for a time, the family just happened to still live in one wing. But it wasn't just about money. There was another massive crisis brewing: staffing. Before World War I, domestic service was a huge industry, employing millions of Americans. But by the 1930s, that world was gone. Young people didn't want to be servants anymore. They wanted factory jobs, or to be clerks in an office. You could have all the money in the world, but if you can't find anyone willing to work in your 100-room mansion, what do? Sure, technology helped. Modern appliances, central heating, they made things easier. But no vacuum cleaner or dishwasher could solve the fundamental problem of scale. A 100-room house is always going to be a nightmare to run compared to a normal home. Then came the final blow, the Great Depression. The stock market crash wiped out fortunes. Families who were already struggling to maintain these enormous houses suddenly saw their investment income vanish. They had to make a choice. Some held on for a while, burning through their capital. But most came to the same logical conclusion: it's more important to save the family fortune than the family mansion. And so, the houses came down. By the 1950s, the Gilded Age mansion, as a symbol of personal wealth and power, was effectively extinct. The ones that survived became museums, schools, or offices. Not a single one continued to function as the private palace its builders had intended. The era of building castles for yourself was over. But here's the interesting twist. The wealthy didn't disappear. In fact, the billionaires of today have fortunes that would make the Vanderbilts look poor. So what changed? They learned to live differently. The massive, visible displays of wealth, like a 250-room house, just invited public anger, higher taxes, and government regulation. It became smarter to be rich without being so obvious about it. So, where did all that money go, if not into giant houses? The modern billionaire owns more than George Vanderbilt ever could have dreamed of. You just can't see it all. Think of Bill Gates. He lives in a very large high-tech house known as Xanadu 2.0. It's huge by any normal standard, but it's not the Biltmore. It's not a palace built to project power to the entire world. The wealth of today is more abstract. It's in stock portfolios, private equity, sprawling tech companies, and intellectual property. It's in super yachts that can sail away from public view, private jets that fly above it all, and vast art collections stored in climate-controlled freeports. The Gilded Age was about building physical monuments to your success. Today, wealth is about mobility, privacy, and influence that isn't tied to a single high-maintenance piece of real estate. The story of America's lost mansions isn't just about architecture or economics. It's about a fundamental shift in how wealth is perceived and expressed in our society. The palaces of the past were torn down not just because they were expensive, but because the very idea they represented of a permanent, visible, landowning aristocracy no longer fit in the modern world. The American dream changed, and the old houses were left behind. Why don't today's billionaires build palaces like the robber barons of the Gilded Age? I mean, think about it. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, their wealth absolutely dwarfs that of people like Rockefeller or Vanderbilt, even when you adjust for inflation. So where are the modern-day Biltmore Estates or Hearst castles? The answer isn't that they're being modest. It reveals a far more sophisticated, and perhaps more troubling, way of wielding power and accumulating wealth. Let's start with a simple thought experiment. Imagine a billionaire with $10 billion. They decide to build a $500 million palace. That sounds like a display of wealth, right? But financially, it's a disaster. First, the construction itself just consumes $500 million of capital. Then, the annual operating costs for staff, utilities, and upkeep will drain millions more each year. Add property taxes to that bill, and what about appreciation? A highly customized, personal palace like that rarely appreciates in value like a normal property. It's often a white elephant that's hard to sell. Finally, when the owner passes away, estate taxes will take another massive bite out of its value. From a purely financial perspective, a palace is a wealth destruction machine. Now, what if that same $500 million was put into a diversified investment portfolio? Stocks, bonds, private equity, you name it. Instead of costing money every year, it generates substantial returns. With professional management, tax liabilities are minimized. Smart estate planning ensures that wealth is protected and passed on to future generations. The portfolio isn't just preserving wealth, it's a wealth multiplication machine. Modern billionaires understand this calculation perfectly. They live in very comfortable, often enormous homes by any normal standard, but they avoid the colossal, resource-draining scale of the Gilded Age mansions. Their wealth isn't sitting in marble and granite, it's flowing through channels that generate even more wealth. So, if it's not going into palaces, where does all that money go? This is where things get really interesting. Let's look back at John D. Rockefeller. He built his famous estate, Kykut, overlooking the Hudson River. It cost millions, but he also established the Rockefeller Foundation, which now controls billions. Which one do you think represents more real-world power? The mansion that impresses visitors, or the foundation that helped build the headquarters of the United Nations? Rockefeller created the blueprint that today's billionaires have perfected. The strategy is to transform your public image from a ruthless monopolist into a celebrated philanthropist through massive, strategic, charitable giving. This move is brilliant because it accomplishes several things at once. First, it provides enormous tax deductions, shielding vast amounts of wealth from the government. Second, it allows them to shape public policy and social agendas on a global scale, all without the machines of democratic oversight. And third, it buys them a positive reputation and a lasting legacy. Most importantly, it allows their wealth to exercise power across generations in a way a physical mansion never could. The modern charitable foundation is a fascinating hybrid. It's part non-profit, part dynastic trust. When assets are moved into a foundation, they are completely shielded from estate taxes. The foundation itself pays no taxes on its investment income. The grants it makes to charities provide a public benefit, sure, but they are always aligned with the founder's personal priorities and vision for the world. Family members often sit on the board as trustees, giving them control over these billions in perpetuity. The scale is something the Gilded Age barons couldn't even dream of. Take the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. With an endowment exceeding $50 billion, it's the largest private charitable foundation on the planet. Its annual grants, totaling over $5 billion, shape global health policy, education reform, and agricultural development in countries all over the world. Their influence on international vaccination programs alone affects hundreds of millions of people. This is a level of power a palace simply cannot provide. A palace displays wealth. A foundation with a $50 billion endowment directs the priorities of governments, universities, and international organizations. Gates Foundation funding can determine which diseases get researched, which educational strategies get implemented in schools, and which farming techniques are promoted in developing nations. This is real, persistent power that exists no matter where Bill Gates sleeps at night. But the model keeps evolving. In 2015, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan created the Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative. They took the foundation concept and pushed it even further. Instead of a traditional charitable foundation, they structured their philanthropy as a limited liability company, or LLC. This gives them an incredible amount of flexibility. An LLC can make political donations. It can invest in for-profit companies. It can lobby for policy changes. These are all things that traditional foundations are legally restricted from doing. When Zuckerberg pledged to transfer 99% of his Facebook shares to the initiative, it represented a value of over $100 billion at different points in time. The LLC structure immediately drew criticism, and for good reason. It neatly sidesteps the rules that apply to normal charitable foundations. For instance, foundations are required to distribute at least 5% of their assets every year to qualified charities. They face strict limits on political activity and must disclose their finances to the public. The Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative has none of these obligations. It can operate as a private investment vehicle, pursuing any goal the founders choose, charitable, political, or for-profitable, while potentially benefiting from the same tax deductions associated with charitable giving. This shift represents a fundamental change in how the ultra-wealthy exert influence. The Gilded Age robber barons built monuments to their own egos. They were powerful, yes, but their power was often direct and visible control over an industry, influence over politicians. Today's tech titans and financiers have learned to wield a softer, more subtle, and arguably far more pervasive form of power. Their wealth isn't locked up in physical assets. It's liquid, dynamic, and deployed through complex legal structures that blur the lines between philanthropy, investment, and political influence. There's another, simpler reason we don't see modern palaces: privacy. In the age of Google Maps and social media, a landmark estate is a security nightmare and a magnet for unwanted attention. Billionaires today prefer sprawling, but discreet, compounds in places like Montana or Hawaii, often using conservation easements to their advantage. A wealthy landowner like Ted Turner can donate the development rights on his vast ranches, receive a massive tax deduction, and still retain full use and control of the land. He gets the tax benefit and the privacy, all while appearing to do something good for the environment. It's a win-win for him. So, the next time you wonder why billionaires aren't building castles, remember this: they're building something far more powerful. They're building foundations, LLCs, and dynastic trusts. They're not just preserving their wealth, they're converting it into a form of perpetual influence that can shape society for generations to come. Long after any physical palace would have crumbled, the age of ostentatious displays isn't over. It has just become more sophisticated, more strategic, and hidden in plain sight within the financial and legal architecture of our modern world. Have you ever wondered why we do once see modern billionaires like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos building gigantic 250-room palaces, like the Vanderbilts did a century ago? The answer reveals a fascinating shift in how the ultra-wealthy live, think, and protect their fortunes. These weren't just houses, they were statements, but they were also incredibly inefficient. Even with modern conveniences like central heating, a 100-room house was a logistical nightmare and a constant drain on resources. The sheer scale was the problem. Most chose the fortune. The operating costs were simply too high, and they began tearing the massive houses down. By 1950, the era of the American mansion as a private residence was over. The few that survived became museums, schools, or other institutions, public relics of a bygone era. The age of building personal palaces had ended for good. But the wealthy didn't disappear. They just got smarter. They adapted to a world where flaunting your wealth could bring unwanted attention from the taxman, from regulators, and from an angry public. The question wasn't if they would spend lavishly, but how. Fast forward to today, and look at the tech billionaires. Take Bill Gates. In fact, it's the opposite. The design is deliberately understated. Technology and privacy are the priorities, not grandeur and display. Jeff Bezos employs a similar strategy. He owns hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate, but it's spread out. A mansion in Beverly Hills, apartments in New York, a ranch in Texas, a compound in Washington. Individually, each property is substantial, but none are on the scale of a Gilded Age palace. In total, Bezos likely owns more residential square footage than the Vanderbilts ever did, but it's distributed, decentralized, and often hidden behind corporate entities. We, the public, rarely see any of it. Then there's Mark Zuckerberg. He bought his Palo Alto home for $7 million, a relatively modest house for a billionaire, but then he spent another $43 million buying the 4 surrounding properties. He wasn't building a bigger mansion, he was building a buffer zone. His investment was about creating privacy, a defensive move to prevent anyone from getting a close look at his life. This pattern reveals a complete change in mindset. Today's ultra-wealthy understand the problems that a visible palace creates. First and foremost is security. A giant, obvious mansion is a target. It advertises the location of your family, making them vulnerable. Ever since the Lindbergh baby kidnapping in 1932, security has been a paramount concern for the rich. Modern billionaires prefer to stay anonymous and keep their families out of the spotlight. A hidden, secure compound is far more valuable than a showpiece. Second, there's taxation. You can't hide a 250-room mansion from the property assessor. The annual tax bill would be enormous, leading to constant battles with local governments. This allows them to minimize their tax burden and avoid unnecessary financial headaches. Third is public perception. In the Gilded Age, extreme wealth was something to be celebrated and displayed. It invites criticism and makes you a symbol of the very thing people are protesting against. Why paint a target on your own back? The new rich learn to enjoy their wealth without rubbing it in everyone's face. And finally, there's the issue of legacy. The houses were too big, too impractical, and too tied to a single location. Modern billionaires have a more global, flexible view of wealth. Their dynasty isn't a building, it's a portfolio. They invest in companies, foundations, and assets that can be managed from anywhere in the world. Their legacy is mobile, digital, and far more durable than a pile of bricks and mortar. Think about it. A house is a fixed, illiquid asset. It's vulnerable to economic downturns, natural disasters, and changing social tides. The modern billionaire's home is no longer the centerpiece of their fortune. It's just one small part of a much larger, more complex financial empire. So, the modern billionaire does own more than George Vanderbilt could ever have imagined. He just can't see it. Their wealth isn't in a single, visible palace. It's in stock portfolios, private equity, sprawling real estate holdings spread across continents, and philanthropic foundations that shape the world. They traded the conspicuous consumption of the past for a new model, discreet, strategic, and far more powerful. The palace isn't gone. It has simply been transformed into something invisible, decentralized, and global. And in today's world, that's the ultimate power move. Have you ever wondered why today's billionaires, people with unimaginable fortunes, don't live in gigantic, Versailles-like palaces? I mean, think about the Gilded Age tycoons like the Vanderbilts. The answer is surprisingly complex, and it reveals a lot about how the ultra-wealthy think about money, power, and privacy in the 21st century. It turns out, building a colossal palace is actually a terrible financial and strategic move for a modern billionaire. Let's break down why. This is why you see so many billionaires establishing legal residency in states with no income tax, like Florida, Texas, or Nevada. A massive high-profile mansion is a magnet for high property taxes. It's a stationary target that assessors love. By keeping their residences relatively modest, or at least appearing that way, they minimize a significant annual expense. Then there's the public relations nightmare. We live in an age of social media and constant scrutiny. Building a palace is like sending out a formal invitation for media coverage and public criticism. Remember the Occupy Wall Street movement? It highlighted a deep public resentment towards visible wealth inequality. Flaunting a $500 million home is just asking for trouble. It makes you a prime target for politicians looking to score populist points. They've learned that it's better to be powerful quietly than to be a loud, shiny target. So, what's the alternative? Instead of pouring hundreds of millions into a single flashy mansion, the new strategy is to shift that wealth into something else entirely. They deploy their capital across diverse holdings that actually generate returns, rather than just sitting there costing money. This brings us to the compound strategy, which is especially popular among Silicon Valley billionaires. Instead of one enormous house, they buy a huge piece of land and build multiple, smaller structures. Each building has a specific purpose. When you add up all the square footage, it might be just as big, or even bigger, than one of those old Gilded Age mansions. It doesn't scream, "Look at me." Take Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle. In 2012, he bought an entire Hawaiian island, Lanai, for a reported $300 million. He literally controls an island, something no Vanderbilt ever did. But if you look at the property, you won't find a single, gigantic palace visible from the sea. The individual buildings are relatively small and spread out. The real power isn't in the house. It's in owning the entire island. You'll rarely find a billionaire's name directly on a property deed. Instead, they use a web of limited liability companies, or LLCs, trusts, and other legal entities. Public records might show that an estate is owned by something like 123 Property Holdings LLC. Trying to connect that LLC back to a specific individual requires some serious detective work. This isn't just paranoia. It's a deliberate, professionally managed privacy shield, and it serves multiple purposes. First, security. If it's hard to find where you live, it's harder for threats to target you or your family. The celebrity premium is a real thing. A house is often valued higher simply because a famous person owns it. The financial logic extends even further, especially when it comes to estate planning. A $100 million mansion is a $100 million asset that's subject to estate tax. But if you invest that same $100 million in a portfolio of productive assets, like stocks or private companies, that money grows. It generates more income. And with sophisticated estate planning, a large portion of that wealth can be legally shielded from taxes for the next generation. The mansion just sits there, costing you money in upkeep and taxes. An investment portfolio multiplies your wealth. There's another clever tool they use: conservation easements. Let's say a billionaire owns a massive ranch. They can donate the development rights to that land, meaning they legally agree not to build a shopping mall or a subdivision on it. In return, they get a substantial tax deduction. They still get to use and enjoy the land, but they've captured a huge tax benefit by promising to conserve it. Ted Turner is famous for using this strategy on his vast ranches across the American West. He maintains control of his land while saving millions in taxes. So let's do the math. Imagine a billionaire with $10 billion in assets. The construction itself consumes a huge chunk of capital. Then come the annual operating costs for staff, maintenance, and utilities, which can be millions of dollars. The ultimate status symbol is no longer a big house. It's financial invincibility and the power that comes from being untouchable. The tax implications are enormous. Imagine a billionaire donates $10 billion to their own charitable foundation. Right away, they get a tax deduction for the full amount. At the highest tax rates, this could save them around $4 billion in federal taxes. Now, what about the other $6 billion? That's the amount they've genuinely given up, but in return, they've bought something priceless. Immense influence over how that money is used, forever. The foundation invests that $6 billion, and the returns fund grants for decades, even centuries. The donor's personal priorities and vision will shape charitable giving long after they're gone. It's a way to cement a legacy and steer society in a direction of their choosing. But there's another, even more direct way for billionaires to buy influence, one that a fleet of super yachts or a dozen mansions could never match: owning the media. Take Jeff Bezos. In 2013, he bought the Washington Post for $250 million. For a man who was already worth over $100 billion at the time, this was pocket change. It was less than what some people spend on a single painting. But what did he get for it? He got ownership of one of America's most influential newspapers, a publication that literally shapes the political conversation in the nation's capital. Now, to be fair, the Post operates independently under Bezos's ownership. It maintains the same journalistic standards it had before he came along. But the simple fact of his ownership inevitably raises questions. How will the paper cover Amazon, his primary business? What about his space company, Blue Origin, or his personal life? The potential for conflict of interest, or even the perception of it, is always there. Historically, newspaper publishers have always wielded enormous political influence. For less than the cost of maintaining a massive estate for a couple of years, Bezos acquired that same kind of power. And he's not alone. This has become a clear trend among the ultra-wealthy. Laurene Powell Jobs, the widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs, bought a majority stake in The Atlantic magazine in 2017. A year later, Mark Benioff, the founder of Salesforce, bought Time magazine for $190 million. That same year, Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the Los Angeles Times for $500 million. In every single one of these cases, billionaires acquired major, historic media outlets for sums that were just a tiny fraction of their total net worth. This pattern isn't a coincidence. It's a calculated strategy. Major media properties grant a level of prestige and influence that far outweighs their financial value. The truth is, most of these legacy publications operate at a loss or on razor-thin profit margins. This makes them completely unattractive to investors who are only focused on the bottom line. But for a billionaire who isn't trying to squeeze out a profit, but is instead looking for a platform to shape public discourse, these properties are incredible bargains. The cost of ownership is trivial to them, but the potential for influence is astronomical. Of course, the most extreme and high-profile example of this strategy is Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, now X. In 2022, he paid approximately $44 billion. At the time, the platform had around 400 million users and was a primary channel for global political discourse, breaking news, and public debate. Musk's purchase gave him direct control over everything. He controls the algorithms that decide what hundreds of millions of people see in their feeds. He controls the moderation policies that determine what they can and can't say. He controls the very features that shape how people interact on the platform. The price tag was substantial, even for Musk. He had to leverage other assets and take on a significant amount of debt to make it happen. But the purchase gave him something no private island or collection of sports cars could ever offer. Twitter isn't just a company, it's a piece of global infrastructure. It's a platform that politicians, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens all over the world depend on to communicate. By controlling that platform, Musk gained a shocking level of influence over the public conversation itself. It's useful to compare this new form of power to the Gilded Age tycoons of the late 19th century. Think of John D. Rockefeller. He controlled 90% of all oil refining in America through his company, Standard Oil. This gave him incredible economic power and, as a result, massive political influence. But his power, as immense as it was, still operated through the mechanisms of the market, and ultimately, it was constrained by things like antitrust laws, which eventually broke up his monopoly. The power wielded by modern platform owners is different. It's more direct, more subtle, and arguably, more pervasive. They don't just control a market for a physical commodity like oil. They control the digital systems through which information flows, conversations happen, and entire communities are formed. Mark Zuckerberg is a perfect example. He controls Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Together, these platforms have more than 3 billion users. That's a population larger than any country on Earth, larger than China and India combined. The algorithms that decide what content those 3 billion people see, the policies that govern what they can post, and the data collection practices that monetize their attention and behavior, all of it is controlled by Zuckerberg and his team at Meta. No king, no president, no prime minister in history has ever exercised such a direct and personal power over the daily lives of so many people. Let's circle back to Jeff Bezos. He didn't just buy a newspaper. They're buying a seat at the table where the rules of society are debated and decided. Why don't billionaires build palaces anymore? A century ago, the richest people in America, like the Vanderbilts, built extravagant mansions to show off their wealth. Think of the Biltmore Estate, a magnificent castle designed to be admired. Today, the ultra-wealthy have more money than ever, but their approach to power and real estate has completely changed. Why? Let's look at Jeff Bezos. He doesn't just own Amazon, the e-commerce giant. He also owns the Washington Post, a major media outlet, and Blue Origin, a company aiming to commercialize space travel. This isn't just a collection of businesses, it's a vertically integrated empire. You have e-commerce, cloud computing, media, and aerospace all under one roof. This combination creates a level of economic control and political influence that Gilded Age tycoons could only dream of. This influence isn't accidental. Major corporations spend hundreds of millions every year on lobbying and campaign contributions. Since the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010, the floodgates for corporate money and politics have opened wide. Billionaires can now fund entire political movements, shaping elections and public policy on a massive scale. So, here's the modern billionaire's calculation. Why spend hundreds of millions on a lavish palace that just sits there, looking pretty but generating no income or real power? For the same amount of money, you could fund a foundation that influences global health policy by a media company that shapes public discourse, or acquire a social media platform that controls how billions of people communicate and share information. It's not that wealth has disappeared, it's that far more effective tools of power have emerged. The Vanderbilts built monuments to themselves that are now just tourist attractions. Today, as billionaires build complex systems of control that most of us don't even recognize as concentrated power. The wealth is greater, the influence is deeper, but it's all much less visible. But even the ultra-wealthy need a place to live, and what they build now shows just how much elite culture has changed. Take Mark Zuckerberg's compound in Hawaii. Starting in 2014, he began buying up hundreds of acres on the island of Kauai for over $100 million. The land includes beaches, forests, and old plantation grounds. Then, in 2016, he started building a 6-foot wall around parts of it. This sparked a lot of controversy, with some locals accusing him of neocolonialism. That wall wasn't for decoration. It was purely functional, designed to block any view and prevent anyone from getting in. This is the new fortress mentality of billionaire real estate. Instead of building a palace to invite admiration, Zuckerberg built a barrier to enforce total exclusion. The difference between this and Biltmore couldn't be more stark. George Vanderbilt built his mansion on a hill for everyone to see. Zuckerberg hides behind a wall on a remote island and seems to resent any attention. Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, took this fortress concept to its logical extreme. In 2012, he bought 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai for about $300 million. That's a 140-square-mile island with about 3,000 residents. Ellison now controls nearly an entire island, something no American tycoon had done since the 19th century. He hasn't built one single mega mansion. Instead, he's developing multiple properties, investing in luxury resorts, and running conservation projects. He treats the entire island as his private estate. The geographic isolation provides a level of security and privacy that no wall could ever offer. When you own the island, you control who comes and goes. Another popular strategy is the ranch estate. Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, owns about 2 million acres across states like Montana, New Mexico, and Nebraska, making him one of the largest private landowners in America. But he's not number one. That title belongs to John Malone, a media magnate who owns around 2.2 million acres. Both of them built their massive landholdings piece by piece over decades, buying up smaller ranches and farms to create enormous private territories. This strategy combines the fortress mentality with a kind of modern feudalism. These vast ranches are working landscapes, often focused on conservation, but they are also private kingdoms. They are so remote and so large that they offer ultimate privacy. You can't just walk up to the property line. It could take hours to even reach the main residence. This is a very different kind of statement than a mansion on Fifth Avenue. It's a statement of dominion over the land itself, a return to an older, more fundamental form of power. So, what does this all mean? The shift from palaces to private islands and sprawling ranches shows a fundamental change in the nature of wealth and power. The old elite wanted to be seen. They wanted their wealth to be visible, to be a public spectacle that confirmed their status. The new elite values privacy and control above all else. They operate from behind walls, from remote islands, and from the digital infrastructure that underpins our society. Their power is no longer just in what they own, but in the systems they control: media, data, logistics, and even the land itself. The palace was a symbol of having arrived. The modern fortress is a tool for staying separate. It reflects a world where the gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else has become a chasm, not just economically, but physically. The old money built monuments for us to look at. The new money builds worlds for them to live in, far away from the rest of us. The age of palaces is over. The age of fortresses has begun. Have you ever wondered where the world's billionaires live? If you're picturing sprawling Versailles-like palaces, you might be a few decades behind. The new elite aren't building monuments to their wealth in the same way the Vanderbilts or Rockefellers once did. Instead, they're opting for something far more subtle, strategic, and in some cases, downright strange. Forget the 250-room mansion. Today's super-rich are redefining what it means to have a home, and their choices reveal a fascinating shift in the psychology of wealth, power, and the future. Let's start with the new landed gentry. Billionaires like Ted Turner and John Malone aren't buying land to build showpiece estates. They're acquiring vast, working ranches where, talking millions of acres, these properties aren't just for show. They generate income from things like cattle, bison, and even conservation activities. The homes on these ranches are often surprisingly modest. Instead of a single, colossal palace, you might find a collection of smaller, functional structures. Why? Because for this new class of landowner, the ultimate power isn't in a flashy house, it's in controlling territory. There's another clever layer to this: conservation. Many of these wealthy landowners place what are called conservation easements on their properties. This is a legal agreement that permanently restricts future development on the land, protecting it for generations. In return for giving up these development rights, the owner receives massive tax deductions. Ted Turner, for example, has protected hundreds of thousands of acres this way, reportedly saving tens of millions of dollars in taxes. It's a win-win for them. They get to keep using their beautiful wild land, enjoy a significant financial benefit, and publicly position themselves as environmental heroes. It's a masterclass in modern wealth management, combining privacy, power, and public relations all in one. But while some billionaires are looking to the land for peace and tax breaks, others are looking underground for survival. This brings us to one of the most revealing trends: the doomsday bunker. Ever since the 2008 financial crisis, a growing number of elites, particularly from Silicon Valley, have been preparing for the end of the world as we know it. They call it the event, a catch-all term for any potential societal collapse, whether it's from a pandemic, civil unrest, or environmental catastrophe. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, famously purchased a massive property in New Zealand and secured citizenship there, seeing it as an escape hatch from a collapsing United States. He's not alone. Many other tech moguls have quietly acquired remote properties in places like New Zealand or isolated parts of the US, ready to flee at a moment's notice. This survivalist mindset has fueled a booming industry: luxury bunker construction. Companies now specialize in converting decommissioned Cold War missile silos into multi-level high-end underground residences. These aren't your grandpa's fallout shelters. They come equipped with sophisticated air filtration systems to protect against nuclear or biological agents, independent power generation, massive food storage facilities, and military-grade security systems. Inside, they can be as luxurious as any penthouse, with swimming pools, movie theaters, and hydroponic gardens to grow fresh food. The psychology here is a complete 180, from the Gilded Age tycoons. When Cornelius Vanderbilt built his Biltmore Estate, he was making a statement of confidence and permanence. He believed his family and his fortune would endure for generations. The modern billionaire building a bunker is operating from a place of anxiety, even paranoia. They expect society to fall apart and are spending millions to ensure they re the ones who survive it. This shift from palace to fortress to bunker maps, a disturbing journey from confidence to fear. Of course, not every billionaire is preparing for the apocalypse. Some are just seeking a different kind of fortress, the fortress of anonymity. Take Ken Griffin, founder of the hedge fund Citadel. Instead of building a single, attention-grabbing mansion in Chicago, he took a different approach. He purchased multiple floors in some of the city's tallest, most exclusive residential buildings. This strategy gives him all the luxury and space he could want, but without the visibility of a standalone palace. Living in a high-rise offers incredible security advantages. You have controlled access points, professional security staff, and the built-in anonymity that comes from living among other wealthy residents. It's much harder to pinpoint and target one person in a skyscraper than someone living in an isolated estate. Griffin's story also highlights another key driver for the modern billionaire: tax efficiency. In 2022, he announced he was moving his entire company headquarters from Chicago to Miami. The official reasons cited crime and Chicago's political environment, but the financial incentives were undeniable. Florida has no state income tax, lower property taxes, and a famously business-friendly climate. This move shows how, for many of today's super-rich, location is fluid. They are less tied to a specific place or a grand ancestral home. Instead, they prioritize mobility and financial optimization, willing to relocate their lives and their businesses to wherever the tax code is most favorable. The architectural legacy of a grand home is now secondary to the bottom line. Finally, there is a new type of estate that might be the most uniquely modern of all: the corporate campus. Tech giants like Google, Facebook, and Apple have built sprawling headquarters that are more like self-contained cities than traditional offices. These campuses have everything: gourmet restaurants, state-of-the-art gyms, medical clinics, and sometimes even on-site housing for employees. For the billionaire founders and top executives, the campus effectively becomes their estate. It's the ultimate expression of a life dedicated to the corporation, where personal and professional worlds merge into one. So, from vast tax-sheltered ranches and anonymous sky-high penthouses, to paranoid underground bunkers and all-encompassing corporate campuses, the homes of today's billionaires tell a story. It's a story of a shift away from public display and towards private power, from opulent confidence to strategic anxiety. Ever wondered how billionaires live? Do they all have giant, flashy mansions, like you see in old movies? Well, the answer might surprise you. The way the ultra-wealthy live has changed dramatically, and it says a lot about our world today. Let us take a journey from the grand palaces of the past to the hidden fortresses of the present. Imagine a house with 250 rooms, a banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling, a library holding 10,000 books, and its own bowling alley and swimming pool. This isn't a fantasy castle. It's the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. Built by George Vanderbilt in the late 1800s, it was the ultimate statement of wealth and power, designed to be seen, admired, and to last for generations. Biltmore was a symbol of the Gilded Age, a time when titans of industry weren't afraid to show off their incredible fortunes. They built magnificent mansions right on New York's Fifth Avenue, palaces in Newport, Rhode Island, and sprawling country estates. These weren't just homes, they were declarations. They said, "I have arrived, I am powerful, and I am here to stay." These structures were meant to inspire awe, maybe a little envy, and to solidify a family's legacy in brick and stone. But fast forward to today. Where are the Biltmores of the 21st century? You might think of Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people on the planet, but he's not building a 250-room palace for everyone to marvel at. Instead, he has a sprawling remote compound in West Texas for his company, Blue Origin. It covers hundreds of thousands of acres of desert. Sure, it has launch sites and testing facilities for his space ambitions, but it also has private residences. It's less of a public statement and more of a private kingdom, a place to work on his projects far away from the public eye. It's a commercial operation, yes, but it functions like a personal fortress. This shift from public display to private retreat is a key difference between the wealthy of yesterday and today. The old money wanted you to see their wealth. The new money wants to make sure you can't. And Bezos is not alone. This strategy of stealth wealth is the new normal for the super rich. They're not building landmarks. They're creating hideaways. Think of vast ranches in Montana, private islands in the Caribbean, or even nondescript, high-security apartments in the middle of a bustling city like London or New York. The goal isn't to impress the public, but to disappear from it. These properties prioritize privacy and security above all else. They are often protected by gates, surveillance systems, and teams of security personnel. They might be owned through a web of LLCs and trusts, making it nearly impossible to know who the true owner is. It's about minimizing attention, whether that's from the media, the public, or even the tax collector. The modern billionaire understands something crucial. Visible wealth can be a liability. It attracts unwanted attention from all sides: criminals, activists, and politicians. The confidence of the Gilded Age has been replaced by a kind of strategic paranoia. The grand mansion has given way to the fortified compound, the remote ranch, or the anonymous urban bunker. It's a completely different psychology. So, is this change a good thing? On one hand, you could argue it is. Those Gilded Age mansions were absurdly extravagant. They were a symbol of extreme inequality and wasted enormous resources just for show. Many people at the time found them offensive to democratic ideals. In that sense, today's quiet, hidden wealth might seem more modest and less arrogant. But there's a flip side, and it's a big one. At least with Biltmore, you knew who had the money, and you could see what they were doing with it. The wealth was visible. Today, the wealth and power of the super-rich are largely invisible. How can the public hold the powerful accountable if they don't even know what they own? How can a tax assessor value a property hidden behind a maze of shell companies? How will historians study this era when its most significant architectural footprints were designed to be invisible and leave no trace? The public can't photograph what it can't find. The shift from ostentation to obscurity raises some tough questions about transparency and power in our society. Let's go back to Biltmore for a moment, because its story didn't end with the Vanderbilt family. What happened to this massive, expensive-to-maintain house? It survived, but only by becoming something George Vanderbilt never intended. It became a public attraction. Today, Biltmore is one of the biggest tourist draws in North Carolina, welcoming around 1.4 million visitors every year. People drive for hours to walk through its perfectly preserved rooms. You can see the banquet hall table still set for a grand dinner, gaze up at the two-story library shelves, and wander through the beautiful winter garden. The house that was once a private family retreat is now a public museum, a window into a vanished world. It has become a time capsule. And it's not just a museum, it's a thriving business. Admission fees alone bring in tens of millions of dollars each year. The estate now includes hotels, restaurants, a popular winery, and shops. It employs over 2,000 people, making it a major economic engine for the entire region. The very house that nearly drained George Vanderbilt's fortune now generates a substantial income for his descendants and supports a whole community. This transformation from a private home into a commercial enterprise is the only reason Biltmore and other similar mansions from that era still exist. Keeping them as private residences was simply too expensive. They had to adapt or be torn down. Biltmore succeeded because the family was smart. They opened the house to tourists way back in 1930, long before mass tourism was a big industry. They saw the future and adapted. Visiting Biltmore today is a fascinating experience. You get to see what's been preserved, the incredible craftsmanship, the art, the sheer scale of it all. But you also get a sense of what's been lost. You're walking through rooms that were once intensely private, spaces where a family lived, laughed, and entertained their friends. You're taking pictures of furniture and art that were never meant for public viewing. There's a strange irony in it. The ultimate private home could only be saved by becoming completely public. The Vanderbilt's personal life is now a product to be consumed by millions. It makes you wonder about the future of today's billionaire hideaways. Will any of Jeff Bezos' compounds or the secret ranches of other tech moguls be around in 100 years? Will they ever become public museums or tourist attractions? It seems unlikely. Most of them were designed from the very beginning to disappear, not to endure. They were built for privacy, not for posterity. So we are left with this stark contrast. On one side, we have the enduring, visible legacy of Biltmore, a monument to a past era's wealth that now serves the public and fuels a local economy. On the other, we have the hidden, ephemeral fortresses of today's elite, designed to be invisible and leave no mark. It shows how the relationship between wealth, power, and the public has fundamentally changed. The Gilded Age barons built monuments to their own greatness, for better or worse. Today's titans are building bunkers. One was a statement of permanence, The other is a strategy for anonymity. And as we look to the future, we have to ask ourselves, which world do we prefer? A world where wealth is on gaudy display, or a world where it's hidden from view, operating in the shadows? There's no easy answer. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to step inside a real-life palace, a place built not for royalty, but for an American dynasty? Well, for just $75, you can welcome to Biltmore, George Vanderbilt's masterpiece, a world away from our own, yet accessible to anyone with a ticket. What you see inside is truly remarkable. The craftsmanship that brought Biltmore to life simply can't be replicated today. The intricate stone carvings, the rich woodwork, the breathtaking ceiling details, and even the advanced technological systems for its time, all represent skills that have largely vanished from modern construction. Today, building codes, soaring labor costs, and different architectural priorities make this kind of work impossibly expensive, even for today's billionaires. The sheer scale of Biltmore is astonishing. Just walking through it takes hours. The vast distances between rooms, the soaring heights of the ceilings, the epic dimensions of the public spaces, all of it dwarfs what even the most luxurious modern homes attempt. Contemporary mansions might boast expensive materials and smart technology, but they rarely achieve the monumental scale that defined the Gilded Age. Back then, size wasn't just about space, it was a statement. Today, that kind of grandeur no longer serves the same social or practical purpose. But this incredible preservation comes at a cost. Biltmore is essentially frozen in the year 1895. It's maintained as a historical exhibit, not an evolving, living residence. While members of the Vanderbilt family still live on the property, they occupy a small, separate section, remaining invisible to the millions of tourists who walk the halls. The house has become a museum that happens to have descendants living nearby, rather than a family home that graciously welcomes visitors. This transformation ensured its survival, but it also stripped away its original purpose as a generational home. To truly appreciate Biltmore's survival, you have to look at what we've lost. Of the hundreds of comparable mansions built during America's Gilded Age, less than a dozen remain in anything close to their original condition. The grand Vanderbilt mansions that once lined Fifth Avenue in New York, gone. The opulent Palmer Mansion in Chicago, demolished. Dozens of the legendary Newport cottages, vanished. San Francisco lost almost its entire stock of Gilded Age architecture in the 1906 earthquake and the development that followed. Today, most American cities are lucky to have one or two examples left, usually preserved as museums or converted for institutional use. What we lost wasn't just buildings, it was an entire approach to construction. The Gilded Age cultivated an army of master craftsmen who specialized in skills that took a lifetime to perfect: stone carving, decorative plasterwork, hand-forged metal, and more. These trades supported entire communities of artisans who passed down techniques from one generation to the next. When the era of mansion building ended, these skills, and the communities they supported, largely disappeared. Modern construction uses different methods, different materials, and completely different labor structures. The knowledge of how to build another Biltmore has been substantially lost to time. The cultural loss is even harder to measure. Gilded Age mansions represented a very specific attitude towards wealth. It was an era that valued permanent, physical monuments over abstract financial instruments. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore to stand for centuries, to house generations of his descendants, and to serve as a powerful, visible testament to his family's achievements. He poured enormous resources into something that generated no direct financial return, but created an aesthetic and cultural value that we still flock to appreciate more than a century later. Modern billionaires make very different choices. Their immense wealth flows into foundations, media empires, tech platforms, and complex investment portfolios that generate returns and exert influence. These are, in many ways, more financially rational choices than building a massive stone house. They preserve and grow wealth, rather than just consuming it. They shape policy and society in ways a building never could. But they don't create anything tangible and beautiful that will draw tourists 100 years from now. There will be no lines to see a historic hedge fund. It's also important to remember the other side of this story. The very tax system that made maintaining these grand mansions impossible also funded genuine public goods. The Gilded Age, for all its splendor, concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite, leaving the vast majority of the population with limited access to education, healthcare, or economic opportunity. The tax reforms that came later redistributed those resources, creating broader prosperity and a more stable society for everyone. So, when you walk the magnificent halls of Biltmore, you're walking through more than just a house. You're seeing the ghost of a lost art, a monument to a different idea of wealth, and a survivor of a bygone era. It represents a world of incredible beauty and craftsmanship that vanished, but it also reminds us of the economic shifts that, while ending the age of palaces, helped build the foundations of the world we live in today. It's a trade-off that defines modern America, captured perfectly within these stone walls. Back in the Gilded Age, the inequality was, well, in your face. You couldn't miss it. Giant mansions lined the streets, and everyone knew who owned them. This visibility made it easier to challenge. Think about it. Ida Tarbell went after Standard Oil because it was a massive, noticeable entity. Labor unions organized against industrialists, whose palaces were a constant reminder of their immense wealth. Politicians rallied public anger against all that over-the-top excess. Fast forward to today. By most measures, the inequality is actually worse. The gap between the richest Americans and the average family is wider than it was back then. But here's the twist, it's less visible. Today's billionaires are masters of disguise, hiding their wealth behind a maze of LLCs, foundations, and assets spread all over the globe. They wield their power through platforms and media companies that most of us don't even recognize as tools of concentrated wealth. This makes the system so much harder to challenge because it's harder to even see. Now, you might think, so what? At least they're not building ridiculously wasteful mansions. And there's some truth to that. The case for visible wealth isn't about aesthetics or morals, it's about practicality. When inequality is out in the open, democratic societies can actually do something about it. Voters can demand fairer taxes. Lawmakers can regulate monopolies. Journalists can investigate abuses of power. The system stays accountable because the evidence is right there for everyone to see. But when inequality goes invisible, that accountability starts to fade. How do you investigate a foundation's subtle influence on public health policy? How do you regulate a platform's total control over the information we see? And how on earth do you tax wealth that is scattered across hundreds of legal entities in dozens of different countries? The modern ultra-rich have learned to exercise power without leaving behind monuments that document it. Their VA essentially solved the problem that brought down the Gilded Age tycoons by making their wealth and influence almost impossible to perceive. This brings us to a central question. Is this new, invisible inequality better than the flashy, ostentatious inequality of the past? The answer really depends on what worries you most. If your main concern is wastefulness, then yeah, modern efficiency is probably better. A billionaire investing in technology or research is arguably allocating capital more rationally than one building a 250-room house. Society gets more from those investments than from another palace. But if your concern is inequality itself, the picture looks a lot grimmer. Wealth concentration has actually increased. The ultra-wealthy now control a larger slice of the pie than they did in the Gilded Age. The tax system that once reigned in that extreme wealth has been systematically weakened, thanks to decades of lobbying and political influence. The top tax rates have plummeted from over 90% to just 37%. Estate taxes have been slashed. The very mechanisms that forced an estate like Biltmore to become a public museum are weaker now than at any point since the 1920s. And if your concern is accountability, this modern invisibility is a huge problem. Power that operates through foundations, platforms, and media empires is much harder to challenge than power that builds visible palaces. The ultra-wealthy are shaping everything from education and health policy to environmental regulations and the news we consume, all without the public oversight that a democracy requires. Foundations can operate forever with minimal transparency. Platforms control the flow of information with very little regulation. So, the concentration of power has grown, even as the visibility of that power has shrunk. Let's take the Biltmore Estate as a perfect example of this whole dynamic. The house is breathtakingly beautiful, but also completely impractical and wasteful. It's impressive and offensive at the same time. It represents an era when the wealthy built monuments to themselves that we, as tourists, now pay to see. It showcases a level of craftsmanship that modern construction just doesn't attempt. It proves that concentrated wealth, no matter how you feel about it, can create things of lasting beauty. But Biltmore also shows that such monuments can't last, at least not in their original form. George Vanderbilt built his castle to stand for centuries, but it only survives today because his descendants couldn't afford to keep it as a private home. They had to turn it into a commercial business. The house endures because it became something its builder never intended. And that lesson goes far beyond architecture. The billionaires stopped building Biltmores because the world forced them to evolve. But did they evolve into something better, or just something sneakier? Today's wealth is more rationally deployed, more strategically protected, and more politically influential than the fortunes of the Gilded Age. It's also less accountable, less visible, and much harder to challenge through democratic means. Standing on Biltmore's terrace, looking out over the Blue Ridge Mountains, you see a view that feels timeless. The forests have matured, The roads wind through trees planted generations ago. The view is just as spectacular as it was when Vanderbilt first chose this spot. The house is still here because it transformed. Fortune that built it is gone because it couldn't be protected. The world that made such a thing possible vanished within 2 decades of its completion. Nothing like it will ever be built again. Not because we lack the ambition or the money, but because the incentives have completely changed. Will future generations visit museums dedicated to charitable foundations? Will they tour the preserved headquarters of defunct social media platforms, or study the archives of 21st century media empires? It's hard to say. These modern institutions might wield more power than Biltmore ever did, but they'll leave behind far fewer monuments for us to photograph. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden forces that shape our world.